Hello everyone, this is Professor Hasselman. This is History 107. And in today's lecture we're going to be talking about the long 19th century. And this is the beginning of the second unit of this course. Now, world histories usually mark a new period in the later 18th century, contending that even though not all the themes are entirely new, there is enough to change to warrant separate treatment. Now, we look then to a period running from around the 1750s to World War I, which historian Eric Hobsbawm has dubbed the long 19th century. Now, this new period saw the decline or disappearance of most of the earlier land-based empires in favor of a simpler pattern of ascendant European imperialism. Europe's growing world dominance correspondingly redefined the world economy, which for a few decades balanced between a European and US core and the peripheralization of almost every other region. Now, the overwhelming new fact that was the steadily growing the overwhelming new fact was the steadily growing manufacturing and military might of Europe, soon intensified by the results of the Industrial Revolution. So again, manufacturing and military might and Industrial Revolution. Industrialization displaced much regional manufacturing in favor of European imports and generated changes in military technology that not only increased Europe's superiority on the seas, but added ready dominance on land as well. Now, around the edges of Europe's industrial dominance, two other themes began to emerge. First, a pattern of selective imitation of certain European developments that might be called the beginnings of modernization, copying elements of technology or education, for example, while retaining distinctive political forms. And second, the emergence of new levels of international connection under Western control that might be called a first stage of contemporary globalization. Now, the British historian who I mentioned earlier, Eric Hobsbawm, called the period that runs from about 1750 to 1914 the long 19th century. Two features of the early modern world, the Columbian Exchange and the land-based gunpowder empires, no longer had much impact in world affairs in the long 19th century. Now, at the same time, two themes of the early modern period persist in this period. The rise of the West, which continued and even accelerated compared to other societies, and the clearer shape of the world economy. The two big developments that frame the 19th century are the emergence of the Industrial Revolution and its brief but decisive monopoly by the West. Now, the Industrial Revolution introduced a new economic form as decisively different from agriculture as agriculture was from hunting and gathering. Now, almost every aspect of life was touched by the Industrial Revolution as it began to take shape, first in Britain, and then in other parts of Western Europe and the United States in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Now, the long 19th century is also shaped by the extent to which Western societies monopolize the industrialization process. Ultimately, industrialization was a global phenomenon. But for the long 19th century itself, the enhancement of European power by industrialization set a framework to which every society had to react. Now, even in its European monopoly, the Industrial Revolution was already in crucial ways global. Europeans industrialized in part because they had already learned that an emphasis on producing processed goods was the way to make money in the world economy. Now, producing processed goods in factories simply enhanced and augmented that advantage. Global relationships had also helped pile up capital in European coffers that was now available for investment in industrial apparatuses. Industrialization had a global impact almost immediately, for example, in causing the deindustrialization of local industries in such places as India and Latin America. As British, European, and American factories poured out cheap manufactured goods, hundreds of thousands of domestic workers in Venezuela, India, and elsewhere were thrown out of work, forcing crucial economic adjustments in these regions. Now, industrialization and European monopoly shaped the period in crucial respects. As Europe industrialized, it enhanced its demands on other parts of the world to produce cheap raw materials and foods and to accept manufactured products. In other words, it increased the extent to which core and peripheral, or somewhat peripheral relationships began to predominate, not just in the Atlantic economy, but worldwide. Latin America, for example, already a peripheral economy, saw more land and more workers devoted to production for export. Products here, such as silver, sugar, coffee, rubber, and fertilizer, still depended on low cost and yielded a modest profit to the society as a whole. As this relationship between Europe and other parts of the world was extended, the gap between core societies and peripheral societies widened as well. Africa was now deeply affected by the world economy. The slave trade was abolished in the 19th century, significantly limiting the principal African product in the world economy. Yet, African attachment to European goods continued, resulting in a scramble to identify other parts that might sell in the world market, such as vegetable oil, palm oil, or cotton. Now, these products, not always suitable to the African environment, required larger amounts of cheap labor, such that, ironically, slavery actually expanded in the 19th century Africa itself. Every part of the world was touched by this relationship, either becoming peripheral or expanding peripheral characteristics. Now, another consequence of this new pattern was an extension of European or Western military advantage from the seas to the land. Now, sea-based power was the dominant source of Western military threat in the early modern period, and it remained crucial. However, a series of developments opened up the possibility of land-based military dominance. These innovations included the development of smaller, more mobile field artillery, the invention of the repeating rifle and the possibility of producing it on a mass scale, and the emergence of early forms of the machine gun. Now, land-based military advantage was also enhanced by transportation improvements, such as steamships, and in a few cases, railroads, along with the telegraph. Now, finally, the development of new tropical medicines was an aid to Western military interaction in key parts of the world. Now, the new Western military edge was demonstrated in a series of major crises that quickly turned into larger patterns of economic exploitation. The first crisis took place in 1798, when Napoleon invaded and conquered Egypt. Now, although the British soon ousted the French, the ease with which European forces could conquer one of the heartland areas of the Islamic world was not lost on the Egyptians or the Ottomans. The balance between European military authority and Middle Eastern military power had been dramatically altered. Now, the second crisis was the First Opium War in China in 1839, in which the British insisted that the Chinese accept opium, produced in British territories in India, and open their markets more generally. Now, the Chinese government, weak but still with some voice, resisted British demands. The result was a conflict in which British and other Western troops easily overcame Chinese forces and pried open the market for opium and for European and Western activities more generally. The third crisis took place in 1853, when an American fleet under Admiral Perry sailed into Ito Bay in Japan and demanded that the Japanese open their markets to Western goods. This was followed by another American expedition and a British expedition in 1854. Now, the Japanese ultimately decided that they had no choice but to open their markets. Now, the fourth crisis arose in 1854 to 1855, as the Russians were poised to seize additional Ottoman territory. Britain and France objected to Russian expansion and engaged Russia in the Crimea. Now, although the conflict was not easy, the West won again, and the power of industrial production, transportation, and technology applied to military activities made it clear that even Russia was behind. Now, after these crises were followed a series of military penetrations from the 1860s onward in Africa, some areas of the Pacific, and elsewhere. There were few parts of the world that Europe tried to enter militarily and failed. In most regions, either direct military penetration or the threat of such penetration now reshaped the world to the West's advantage. The century of imperialism saw a simplification of the world economy patterns we have described previously. Two changes were crucial in this simplification. One, which we have touched on already, was the increasing exploitation of the bulk of the world by core societies, now including the United States. The second change was the effective elimination of externality. No major society could stay external because the West, through military pressure or economic cajoling, simply would not allow it. Now, this new framework was an intensification of patterns that had been sketched to some degree in the early modern period, with the addition of 2 or 3 other components in the long 19th century. The early part of the 19th century, in addition to being an age of early industrialization and imperial military activity, was also an age of Atlantic revolutions. Beginning in the 1770s, a series of uprisings occurred in various parts of the Atlantic world, North America, Western Europe, and Latin America that would last through 1849. The ideological thrusts of these movements brought important political ideas onto the world stage, although many of the revolutionary ideals sincerely held by Europeans did not fit the relationships that Europe was forging in Asia and Africa. Now, we see a lag between the emergence of revolutionary ideas and truly global impact. In the 20th century, however, reformers would use the ideologies of the revolutionary Atlantic world to spur national independence movements and social revolutions. Another new global theme was the need for societies to decide how to respond to Western power. Should societies attempt to resist the West? What aspects of Western development could be imitated to regain or preserve to some degree of regional independence? Now, in the aftermath of Napoleon's invasions in Egypt, a new leader there, Muhammad Ali, undertook a path of reform that he hoped would bring industrialization and modern political and economic conditions to Egypt. Unfortunately, Western pressure and the limits of resources in Egypt tended to confine the durable results of Ali's reform to the production of new crops, or new cash crops, that could serve the world market. Slightly later, the Ottoman Empire undertook reforms with mixed results. Russia's reforms, beginning with the emancipation of the serfs in 1861, enabled that nation's participation in the industrialization process by the 1890s. Now, Western power affected different regions differently. Some areas, such as India, and increasingly Africa, were held as outright colonies. Some areas, such as China, were simply targets of interference. Now, the responses of different regions varied. Even at the crest of European power, we must look at world history in terms of interactions and not simply impositions. A subordinate theme of the 19th century was the tentative emergence of international institutions and arrangements that accompanied industrialization and the increasingly global qualities of the world economy. Soon after the middle of the 19th century, for example, the Universal Postal Union was formed, as was the International Red Cross. Other international agreements allowed technological developments, such as the laying of undersea cables. Such agreements were Western dominated and, in one sense, a facet of imperialism itself. But they were also preliminary hints of a partial international political structure. International connections were furthered by the development of new transportation arrangements, including the cutting of the Suez and Panama Canals. The 1880s saw the emergence of a series of private international non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, dealing with such issues as women's rights and white slavery. New patterns of cultural context are intriguing at the end of the long 19th century. The first sign of the potential for what we would call a global consumer culture emerged in the final decades of the 19th century with the internationalization of several Western sports, including soccer and American baseball. This seemingly trivial development points to a final facet of the long 19th century. Beneath the surface of exploitation and imperialism, new kinds of global connections and contacts were emerging. Some of these were institutional, and some were evidence of international cultural interactions that helped shape the next period in world history. Let's close with a note on the brevity of the long 19th century. The long 19th century is a story of Western dominance, which makes this period, at least superficial, seem unusually simple. The reason we end the period in 1914 is not only because that date marks the beginning of World War I, but also because as a result of World War I, the easy Western dominance in the world began to come to an end. Again, this is History 107 with Professor Hasselman, and this is the end of the lecture on the long 19th century.